Wife uncovers husband's affair on honeymoon. A tragic discovery with shocking twists. What if your honeymoon turned into a nightmare? What if, during the most romantic moment of your life, you uncovered a secret that would shatter everything? In this story, the twists are shocking, the danger is real, and nothing is what it seems. Stay tuned until the very end. You won't believe how this one ends. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the beach. The gentle waves whispered as they lapped at the shore. It was their honeymoon. Her heart raced in a different rhythm than before. It was supposed to be perfect. Instead, it felt heavy. Tension hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Her husband, Mark, stood just a few feet away, his back turned to her. But it wasn't his silence that unnerved her. It was the phone he left unattended. She glanced over, the screen of his phone faintly glowing in the dim light. The notification caught her eye. It wasn't the text itself, but the name attached to it. An unfamiliar name. A woman's name. Her breath caught in her throat. The words felt like daggers. "I miss you, Mark." Her fingers trembled as she reached for the phone. Her eyes devoured the message, as if reading it again might make it disappear. But it didn't. It was real. She felt the ground shift beneath her, as if the world itself had cracked wide open. Her chest tightened. Anger, confusion, and a terrible weight settled inside her. She glanced at Mark. He was still facing the ocean, oblivious. Her body moved without thought, her feet leading her to the door of their hotel room. She needed air, needed space. She opened the balcony door. The cool breeze slapped her face. The waves continued their endless rhythm below. But in her mind, everything was spinning. What was she supposed to do now? The phone. That message. Her mind raced. She couldn't go back to the hotel room. She couldn't look at him the same way again. Not after what she'd seen. The minutes felt like hours as she stood there, lost in her thoughts. Then, suddenly, the door behind her opened. Mark's voice broke the silence. "What are you doing out here?" His words felt like an accusation. She didn't answer right away. How could she? He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. She turned slowly to face him. His eyes were cold, detached. A shiver ran down her spine, and then she saw it. The glint of something in his hand. A key to the room next door. Her heart skipped a beat. The truth was finally here. She felt a rush of bile rise in her throat. He opened his mouth to speak, but she didn't wait. Without thinking, she turned and fled. Out the door, down the stairs. The hotel was a maze, but she didn't care. All she could hear was her heartbeat, loud and panicked. The exit was ahead, but she wasn't alone. Mark's footsteps pounded behind her. Closer, closer. She burst through the hotel's front doors into the night. The cool air hit her like a slap. Her breath came in shallow gasps. Then the voice again. Wait. But she didn't stop. The sound of his footsteps faded. She was free. But it was only the beginning of the nightmare. The truth had only just begun to reveal itself. She didn't know where she was running, but it didn't matter. Her feet carried her forward, away from him, away from the truth that threatened to swallow her whole. The night air was sharp, cutting through her skin, but it was the chill inside her that froze her. Her mind whirred with 1,000 questions, none of them having answers. She stumbled down a narrow street, the flickering streetlights casting eerie shadows on the walls. Everything felt wrong. Every corner she turned only led her deeper into the unknown, and yet there was something drawing her back, something that gnawed at her, pulling her towards him, towards the truth. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her hands trembling. It was from Mark. "I'm sorry. Please, just listen to me." The words felt like a slap. Her fingers hovered over the screen, the urge to respond overwhelming her. But she couldn't, not yet. Not until she understood. Her mind replayed the moment she saw the key. The key to the room next door. She had never seen that woman, but she knew. She knew something had been happening behind her back. With every step, the weight of it pressed on her chest harder. But then a thought struck her. Her mind whirred again, a new theory taking shape. What if the key wasn't for someone else? What if it was meant for her? She stopped in her tracks. The realization hit her like a brick. Mark had been acting strange the entire trip. But could he really? Before she could finish the thought, a figure appeared in the distance. Someone walking toward her. Her breath caught in her throat. Was it him? Was it Mark? The figure drew closer, and she could feel her pulse quickening. Her body tensed, ready for whatever confrontation would come. But as the person came into view, she froze. It wasn't Mark. It was a woman with a familiar face. Her heart skipped. She knew her. The woman stepped closer, and with each step, her stomach turned. "Who are you?" The woman's voice was soft, almost gentle, but it was laced with something else. Something sinister. The woman took another step forward, and that's when the realization hit her. It wasn't just a message. It wasn't just a key. It was a setup. Mark wasn't the only one hiding secrets. The woman smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. And then she spoke the words that shattered everything. "You've been in the wrong hotel room the entire time." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Asterisk, "You've been in the wrong hotel room the entire time." Asterisk. Her mind tried to process it, but the pieces didn't fit. The woman's smile widened, a twisted amusement in her eyes. "You think Mark's the only one with secrets?" She continued, her voice low, almost a whisper. Every inch of her body screamed to run, but her legs felt rooted to the ground. "What do you mean?" The question barely escaped her lips. The woman took a step closer, and the scent of her perfume reached her. Something sweet but suffocating. "You really think you're the first to suspect?" The woman laughed, but it wasn't a laugh of humor. It was dark, full of contempt. Her breath came shallow. Her mind was spinning. Mark was hiding something, that much was clear, but this felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. "You've been chasing shadows," the woman said. "Mark's not who you think he is, but neither are you." The word stung more than she expected. She couldn't take it anymore. "Tell me what you're talking about." Her voice cracked with the weight of her desperation. But the woman only shook her head, as if pitying her. "It's too late now," she said, turning away. "You should have known sooner." Without another word, she vanished into the shadows, leaving nothing but a trail of confusion and dread. Her heart pounded, each beat like a hammer in her chest. The streetlights flickered, casting long, twisted shadows, and the night seemed to close in on her. What was she supposed to do now? A scream threatened to escape her throat, but she held it back. She was alone in the dark, without answers. And then another buzz from her phone. She pulled it out, her fingers numb. It was Mark again. "Meet me at the hotel." "The truth is worse than you think." The words burned into her, the desperation in them impossible to ignore. Her mind raced. The hotel. Her heart sank. What was he hiding? What had he been hiding? Everything felt like a game now. The lies, the messages, the keys, and this woman, who was she? No more running. She needed to face it, to understand everything, once and for all. Her legs moved of their own accord, toward the hotel. Each step felt heavier, like the weight of the truth was pulling her down. The door to their hotel room was still locked. She hadn't been back since her discovery, but now, with every step, she could feel the darkness creeping closer. There was something off about this whole situation, something that didn't sit right. She reached for the door, her hand trembling. It swung open with ease. But inside, the room was different. Empty. No bags. No clothes. No sign of Mark. Just a single envelope on the bed. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she approached it. The letter sealed with wax. The only thing written on the front was one name. Her name. With shaking hands, she broke the seal. Inside was a photograph. It was a picture of her, but it wasn't a picture she recognized. It was a photograph of her from the moment they arrived, the moment Mark had been standing behind her, the day he told her he loved her. But this photograph wasn't taken by her. It was taken by someone else, someone who had been watching. And that's when the truth hit her, harder than any revelation before. Mark wasn't the only one lying. She was the one being watched. The game was never about him. It was always about her. The photograph shook in her hand, the edges crinkling as her fingers gripped it tighter. Her breath caught in her throat. Who was watching? The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She wasn't just a victim of Mark's betrayal. She was part of something much darker. Her eyes scanned the photograph again, the eerie detail in the background catching her attention. There, faint but unmistakable, was the outline of a figure. Someone had been standing just out of view, hidden in the shadows. Someone who had been with them from the very beginning. Her legs felt weak, her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the bed, staring at the photo in disbelief. The world around her seemed to blur, everything fading to gray as her mind spun. She couldn't stay here. She had to get out. She had to find out who was behind this, and why. But as she moved to stand, her phone buzzed again. She froze. This time it wasn't Mark. It was an unknown number. Her heart raced. She didn't want to answer. She couldn't. But her curiosity was stronger than her fear. With a trembling hand, she answered the call. The silence on the other end was suffocating. And then a voice, low and distorted, broke the silence. "You're not as innocent as you think." The words hit her like a physical blow. She couldn't breathe. Her mind raced, trying to process what was happening. "Who was this?" "I've been watching you," the voice continued. "Mark is just a pawn. He was never the endgame." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Her pulse thudded in her ears. Mark wasn't the endgame. What was this person talking about? She struggled to find her voice. "Who are you? What do you want?" The voice on the other end chuckled, a cold, hollow sound. "We both know you're not as naive as you pretend. You've been involved in this from the start. You've been playing a part, whether you like it or not." Her stomach twisted. Her mind raced. The pieces were scattered, but she couldn't find a way to put them together. "No, I don't know what you mean," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "You will," the voice said. "Sooner than you think." And then the line went dead. The room seemed to close in on her. A cold sweat broke out across her skin. Her mind raced. She wasn't just in a hotel room anymore. She was caught in something much bigger, something that stretched far beyond her understanding. Mark was a pawn. She was a player. But who was the puppet master? She staggered to the window and looked out. But all she saw were the darkened streets below. The night had deepened, and with it the danger. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Mark. "I'm sorry, I never wanted you to find out like this. But I couldn't stop them. They know everything." Her heart stopped. Mark hadn't betrayed her. He'd been a part of this too. And he had been just as trapped as she was. She dropped the phone onto the bed, her mind reeling. What had they done to him? What had they done to her? She couldn't just sit here. She had to act. With shaking hands, she grabbed her bag, not knowing where she was going, but knowing she couldn't stay here another second. The door slammed behind her as she stepped into the night. Her footsteps echoed on the empty streets, the shadows stretching longer with every step she took. Somewhere out there, the answers were waiting. But so was the danger, and it was coming for her. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she moved through the empty streets. The world felt eerily silent, as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The night felt thick, oppressive. Every streetlight cast an eerie glow, the shadows stretching long and menacing. Her mind raced, the words from the call echoing in her head. Asterisk, you're not as innocent as you think. Asterisk, who were these people? What had she been a part of? She didn't know where to go. There was no place left that felt safe. She glanced down at her phone again, but it wasn't Mark this time. It was another message from the unknown number. Asterisk, it's too late for you to run, asterisk. Her heart dropped to her stomach. She looked around, her senses heightened, every tiny noise making her jump. She couldn't breathe. She was being hunted. She knew it now. Everything she'd done, every choice she'd made, had led her to this moment. But she didn't know who to trust anymore. She thought about the woman, the strange encounter earlier. What had she meant by "you've been in the wrong hotel room the entire time"? Why? And what was Mark involved in? Was he a victim too, or was he playing a part in this twisted game? Another buzz from her phone. This time, the message was different. A photo. She hesitated, her finger hovering over the screen. Then, her curiosity got the best of her. She opened it. It was a picture of her, standing in the street, taken from an alleyway. Someone had been watching her again. Her stomach churned. Her head spun. She wasn't alone out here. Not at all. She quickly turned down an alley, hoping to disappear into the shadows. But the narrow passage seemed to stretch on endlessly. The air grew colder, and then she heard it. Footsteps. Heavy. Steady. Someone was following her. Her pulse raced as she quickened her pace. The alley seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing in, narrowing the path. She couldn't outrun them. She couldn't outrun it. She reached the end of the alley and saw an old, abandoned building ahead. With no other choice, she dashed toward it. She didn't care if it was unsafe, if it was locked. Anything to get away from whoever was hunting her. Her fingers scrambled at the door. It was open. She slipped inside and slammed it shut behind her, her breath coming in desperate gasps. The building was dark, but she could still make out the outline of old furniture and forgotten items scattered around. She crept deeper inside, listening for any sounds of movement outside. The silence was deafening. She pressed her back against the wall, her heart pounding. She had to think. Her mind kept returning to the photograph, the one from the hotel room, the one Mark hadn't taken. Who was watching her? Why? And what was this game they were playing? It felt like a maze. Every corner she turned, every choice she made, only led her deeper into the unknown. She was lost. But there was one thing she knew for sure now. She couldn't run anymore. They were watching. They were everywhere. And the truth was buried somewhere in this nightmare. She had to find it before it was too late. But as she moved deeper into the building, something caught her eye. A door at the far end of the room, slightly ajar. A sliver of light flickered through. She hesitated for a moment. Then she moved toward it. Her footsteps were muffled on the dusty floor as she moved toward the door. The faint light from the crack under the door was the only source of brightness in the dark, abandoned building. Every inch of her body screamed to turn around, to leave, to run. But her legs carried her forward. She reached the door, her hand hovering over the handle. The light beyond beckoned, pulling her in like a moth to a flame. She gripped the handle tightly, turning it slowly, the metal cold against her skin. The door creaked open. The light spilled out, revealing a small, dimly lit room. It looked like an old office, cluttered with papers and old furniture. But there was something off about it. The air was thick with the smell of dust and stale air, but beneath that was something else. Something sharper, something unnatural. Her eyes scanned the room, taking in the scattered files and half-open drawers. But it wasn't the mess that made her stomach twist. It was the figure standing by the window. She froze. It was him. Mark. But not the Mark she knew. His expression was cold, distant, and his eyes were not the eyes of the man she married. He turned to face her, his movements slow, deliberate. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice flat, emotionless. Her heart pounded in her chest, the question hanging between them like a threat. "You," she whispered, trying to understand. "You've been part of this whole time." Mark didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped toward her, his eyes never leaving hers. "You were always meant to find this," he said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. "It's not what you think." The words barely made sense in her head, but she couldn't stop herself from stepping back, her mind reeling. Mark's presence felt wrong. The man she thought she knew was gone, replaced by someone or something else. "I don't understand. What is all this?" She barely recognized her own voice, strained and desperate. Mark's eyes darkened, and he took another step closer. "There are things you don't know, things we were never meant to understand." He paused, his gaze flickering to the papers scattered on the desk. "But you're here now, and it's too late to turn back." Her heart pounded harder, faster, as the room seemed to shrink around her. "What do you mean, too late?" Her voice shook. For the first time, Mark smiled, but it wasn't a smile of comfort. It was something darker, more sinister. "You've been part of this from the beginning," he said, his tone almost mocking. "Everything that's happened to you, it was all part of the plan. You were never meant to escape." The words hit her like a thunderclap, and she felt her knees weaken. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. "This is a mistake. You couldn't have." But Mark cut her off, stepping forward, his eyes narrowing. "It's already done." Before she could react, something in the corner of the room caught her attention. A small, unmarked file lay on the desk, half open, a stack of photographs beside it. Her heart stopped. The photographs were of her. Her every move, every moment she had thought was private, was being watched. Her stomach turned as she realized the truth. The truth she hadn't wanted to see. Mark had never loved her. She was just a pawn, a piece in this twisted game. The woman, the calls, the photographs, it had all been leading here. Her hands shook as she reached for the file, her eyes scanning the documents. And there, at the very top, was her name, her full name. But it wasn't just a name. It was a file, a dossier, a list of things she had never known about herself. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she realized what this meant. This was no longer just about Mark. It was about them. The people who had been pulling the strings from the start. The ones who had been watching her. And Mark, he was no longer her husband. He was a part of their plan, a pawn, just like her. Her mind raced as the weight of everything crashed down on her. What had she been a part of? What had she really signed up for? The truth was more horrifying than she ever could have imagined. And just as the full scope of it sank in, the door behind her slammed shut. The room grew cold. She turned around, eyes wide with terror. A shadow moved in the doorway. The game wasn't over. It was just beginning. Her breath hitched as she turned toward the door. The shadow moved again, slowly, deliberately. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her legs refused to move. She couldn't escape, not this time. The figure stepped into the dim light, and her blood ran cold. It wasn't Mark. It was the woman from earlier, the one who had approached her on the street, the one who had whispered those cryptic words. Her face was calm, eerily serene, as if everything had already been decided. She was wearing the same expression of detachment, as if she had no real stake in this game, other than to watch it unfold. "You shouldn't have come," the woman said softly, her voice low and emotionless. The words sent a shiver down her spine. Her mind spun, trying to piece together the puzzle. But everything felt disconnected, blurry. "What do you want from me?" she finally managed, her voice shaking. The woman's lips curled into a small, cold smile. "We don't want anything from you. You've already given us everything we need." Her hands trembled as she clutched the file in her hands, the truth of it overwhelming her. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls tightening with every word the woman spoke. "You're a part of this now," the woman continued. "It's too late to walk away. And Mark, he's just the beginning." A chill ran through her, colder than anything she'd felt before. Mark had been the beginning. What did that even mean? The woman took a step closer, her eyes darkening. "You don't understand, do you?" she said, her voice a mere whisper. "You've been part of this for longer than you realize. Your every move has been calculated. Every word you've said, every action you've taken, everything was a part of the plan." Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. The honeymoon, Mark's strange behavior, the mysterious woman, the photographs, the calls. It was all connected. But why? What was the end game? She gripped the file tighter, her knuckles white. "You've been chosen," the woman said, as if it was the simplest thing in the world. "You always were. You were meant to be a part of this." Her pulse raced, her head spinning. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I don't understand. What do you want from me?" The woman's eyes glinted with something dark, something dangerous. You are the final piece." And just like that, the floor dropped out from under her. She staggered back, her mind reeling as the weight of the woman's words crashed down on her. The final piece? What did that even mean? Before she could process it, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching from behind her. Another figure. She turned quickly, and there, standing in the doorway, was another person, a man this time, his face hidden in shadow. "Everything is in place," the man said, his voice deep and calm, like someone who had been waiting a long time for this moment. Her heart skipped a beat. This was no longer just about Mark. This was about something bigger. Something far more dangerous. She looked between the woman and the man, fear gripping her chest. What do you want from me?" She repeated, her voice louder this time, the desperation in it impossible to hide. The man stepped forward, his presence overwhelming. "You've already given us everything. The only thing left is for you to accept your place." Her stomach twisted. My place. The woman smiled again, but it was a smile that sent chills down her spine. "Yes," she said, her voice almost soft now. "Your place. You were always a part of the plan." Her head spun. There were no more answers, only more questions, and nothing made sense anymore. Everything she thought she knew was a lie. Mark, the woman, the man, her. The pieces were falling into place, but the puzzle was one she didn't want to solve. Her heart raced as the door slammed shut behind her, and the room seemed to close in. The final piece was her. And the game? It was just getting started. The walls seemed to tighten around her as the man and the woman closed in, their figures looming like shadows. She felt trapped, her breath shallow, her mind frantically trying to make sense of everything. "You," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You can't be serious. I'm not a part of this. I don't want to be. I just want to go home." The woman's eyes flickered with something that resembled pity, but it wasn't kind. It was cold, calculating. "You never had a choice," she said softly, almost regretfully. "This was always meant to happen." The man's deep voice broke in, calm but unsettling. "You were chosen for this from the moment you met Mark. You just didn't see it. You were never supposed to see it." Her heart raced faster. Her thoughts scrambled like 1,000 voices, screaming at once. "Why? What is this? What do you want with me?" She felt the words choke her throat, but she forced them out anyway, as if speaking could somehow make sense of it all. The woman stepped closer. Her smile was eerie, full of something that felt like triumph. "We don't want anything from you," she said, her voice cold but laced with finality. "We just needed you to understand you're the key. You always have been." The man nodded, his expression unreadable. "Mark was never the goal. You were. Everything has been leading to this moment." She stumbled back, her legs weak beneath her. The reality of their words hit her like a cold slap. Mark, she could barely speak his name, the thought of him twisting in her chest. But he was with me. He loved me. The woman's face darkened, her smile faltering for just a moment. "No, he was never meant to love you. He was a distraction, a tool to get you where we needed you." Her mind spun. The room around her felt like it was tilting, the air thick with tension. She couldn't breathe. "What do you mean? What did you need me for?" She could barely form the words, each one feeling like a struggle against the flood of emotions crashing through her. The man spoke again, his voice low and almost affectionate. "We needed your trust, your vulnerability, your ability to feel. You see, the world is a game, and the players are chosen. Mark was never your partner. He was your handler. His job was to get you here, to make you trust him, to make you think you were safe." The words felt like a blow. She shook her head, her thoughts swimming. This isn't real. This can't be real." "Oh, but it is," the woman said, her voice steady. "Everything that's happened to you, your relationship with Mark, your honeymoon, the lies, the betrayal, it's all been orchestrated. Every moment you thought was your choice wasn't. You were being guided." Her breath came in ragged gasps now. "I don't understand. Why? Why me?" The man stepped forward, his eyes piercing into hers. "You were born for this. You were always meant to be a part of this. Mark was just the introduction, the first chapter. You're the one we need to finish the story." Her pulse thundered in her ears. The room felt smaller, the air suffocating. The woman reached out, gently touching her arm. "Don't fight it," she said softly. "You were always a part of this. You just have to accept it. Accept it." Her voice cracked with disbelief. "I won't accept this. I won't be a part of whatever twisted game this is." The woman's expression hardened, her hand falling away from her arm. "You don't have a choice. You're already too deep." The man's voice dropped, the weight of his words heavy in the room. "You're the key, the catalyst. You've been walking this path since the beginning, and now it's time for you to see the truth." The truth. The word echoed in her mind, sharp and bitter. What was the truth? Her thoughts were racing, panic clawing at her chest. She couldn't trust anything. She couldn't trust them. She couldn't even trust herself. Her eyes flicked toward the door. But before she could make a move, the woman stepped in front of it, blocking her escape. "You can't run anymore," the woman said softly, but with an undeniable finality. "We've been waiting for this moment. You've been waiting for this moment." Her heart dropped. The door, the truth, the game. It was all connected. There was no way out. She was trapped, and they knew it. The man's gaze softened slightly, almost as if he felt pity for her. "Don't worry. Once you accept your place, everything will make sense." Her body trembled, the weight of their words sinking into her bones. This wasn't just about Mark. This wasn't about her being betrayed. This was something bigger, something planned, and there was no way to stop it. The silence between them was suffocating as she stood frozen, her mind racing. The game had begun, and now she was a part of it. The room felt like it was closing in on her, the air thick with suffocating tension. Her breath was shallow, her heart beating too fast. She could hear the steady rhythm of it in her ears, drowning out everything else. The woman's eyes bore into hers, watching her every move, every flicker of emotion on her face. "You've known this deep down," the woman said, her voice almost gentle. "You knew something was wrong all along. You just didn't want to see it." Her head spun. She wanted to scream, to run, to deny everything she had just heard. But the truth hung in the air like a weight she couldn't escape. Mark had been part of this plan. He wasn't the man she married. He was never hers. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. Her legs shook beneath her, but she couldn't look away from the woman standing in front of her. "You've been trained for this from the start," the man's voice cut through the silence. "Everything in your life, every choice you thought was yours, was a part of our design. We needed you to trust him, to fall in love, to be vulnerable, and now you're ready. Ready for what?" The words spun in her mind, but none of them made sense. Ready for what? Her voice was almost a whisper, barely audible, but the man heard it. "To accept your place," he replied, stepping closer. His eyes were hard, unwavering. "To take your role in what's coming next." Her heart pounded painfully against her chest. "What role? I don't have a role. I'm not a part of this. I refuse to be." The woman's lips curved into a small, cruel smile. "It's too late to refuse. You've already made your choice." Her pulse raced. "I haven't made any choice. I just wanted my life back. I wanted to be happy. I didn't ask for any of this." The man's voice grew sharper. "You don't understand. Happiness? It's a lie. People like you, people like Mark, *U*, were never meant for happiness. You were meant to be something more, to serve something bigger." She stumbled back, trying to distance herself from their suffocating presence. But there was nowhere to run. She glanced at the door, the only way out, now blocked by the woman. "You're not just a pawn anymore," the man said, his voice cold like steel. "You're the catalyst, the piece that will bring everything into motion." Her mind raced, the pieces clicking into place in a way she couldn't comprehend. "What are you talking about? What's going to happen?" The woman's eyes gleamed. "The world's about to change, and you're the one who will tip the scales. Everything you've seen, everything you've heard, it's all leading to this." The weight of the words settled over her like a thick fog, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the very air around her was changing. The world felt off kilter, twisted. She was no longer sure of anything. Nothing was as it seemed. Mark was part of this. The woman was part of this. And now she was a part of it too. She had been chosen. But chosen for what? The man stepped closer again, his eyes unwavering. "The game isn't over, but you're at the center of it now. The decisions you make next, those asterisks, are the ones that will determine what happens to everyone else." She shook her head. "I don't want any part of this." The woman's smile widened, almost tender. "You already do. The question is, can you live with it?" Her chest tightened. Her heart felt like it was being crushed beneath the weight of their words. She wanted to scream, to break free, but the grip of their gaze was suffocating. The man was waiting for her to react, to make her move, but she was paralyzed. She couldn't move. She couldn't think straight. The walls were closing in, her options dwindling with each passing second. Finally, the woman stepped toward the desk, picking up the file she had seen earlier, the one with her name on it. She flipped it open casually, as if reading a book. "Everything you've done," the woman said, "has led to this. And now the story changes. You will either accept your place or—" She paused, letting the silence stretch, thick and suffocating. "Or you will destroy everything." Her mind was reeling. Destroy everything? She couldn't comprehend it. She didn't know what she was meant to do. But then the man spoke again, his voice low and almost regretful. "We didn't want to hurt you. We didn't want this to break you. But the choices you've made, they were never just yours. We had to make you see." Her chest constricted, her breath coming faster now. "What choices? I don't understand. I don't know what you want from me." The woman's gaze softened for a moment, like a brief flicker of empathy, but it was gone just as quickly. "It's simple," she said, her voice calm and cold. "You have a choice to make. You can join us and help shape what's coming, or you can resist and watch everything fall apart. The weight of the decision bore down on her, a crushing pressure that threatened to suffocate her. Was there any way out, or had they already won? Her mind raced. But one thing was clear. She was no longer in control. And the game? It had only just begun. The air around her felt heavy, thick with the weight of the decision hanging over her. Her chest tightened, each breath coming with more difficulty than the last. The man and the woman stood still, waiting for her answer, their eyes locked on hers, like predators waiting for their prey to make the first move. She felt her heart pounding, each beat a reminder of how far she'd fallen into this web, this twisted game that had been set in motion long before she even knew it existed. Her mind raced, trying to find something, anything, that could make sense of it. Mark, the honeymoon, the photographs, the phone calls. It all pointed back to them, to the game they were playing. But what was her role in this? Why had they chosen her? What did they want from her? The woman's voice sliced through the silence, calm and almost soothing. "You're not the first to be caught in this," she said, almost like she was offering a fragile comfort. "But you're the one who will decide how it ends. Your choice will change everything." The man's gaze was unyielding. "There's no running from this. No turning back. You either accept your place, or you risk everything." Her hands were shaking, the file still clutched tightly in her grip. It felt like a symbol now, a cursed artifact that held the truth she couldn't quite comprehend. But the truth was what had led her here, and the truth was what would keep her trapped. Her stomach churned, and for a moment, she thought she might collapse. She wanted to scream, to run, to push them all away and forget everything. But the walls around her seemed to close in tighter with every passing second. The silence between them grew louder, suffocating her, pushing her into a corner where the only escape was to make a choice. "What happens if I refuse?" she managed to say, her voice hoarse with fear and defiance. The woman's expression didn't change. "Then everything crumbles. Mark, the plan, the people who are waiting for you, it all falls apart." The man stepped forward now, his presence looming like a shadow. "And you will lose everything. You will watch as the world you thought you knew disintegrates. We don't want that for you, but we're not giving you the luxury of ignorance anymore. You will see what you were always meant to see." Her mind reeled, but the words felt like a promise, a chilling, inevitable truth. Could she really walk away? Was there any escape? The pressure mounted. It wasn't just about survival. It was about what came next, what role she would play in all of this, and what price she would have to pay for it. She wanted to scream again, but instead, she stood frozen. A decision lingered, heavy in the air. A choice she didn't feel equipped to make. The woman's eyes softened, but only briefly. "You can't change what's already been set in motion, but you can choose how you move forward." Her pulse raced, her thoughts scattered, and the room seemed to close in, the shadows growing longer, darker. Everything she had ever known was crumbling. The life she thought she had was slipping through her fingers, and there was no way to stop it. She wasn't ready for this. She wasn't ready to make the kind of decision that would define everything. But there was no choice anymore. The silence stretched between them as they waited, their eyes unwavering, their hands folded, as if they had already won. And maybe, just maybe they had. She took a deep breath. The sound of her heart pounding in her ears drowned everything else out. The choice had been made for her long ago. She could feel it in the air, and with that realization, her future was sealed. "I'll accept," she whispered, barely able to hear the words as they left her lips. But once they were spoken, there was no turning back. The woman's smile returned, this time warmer, almost triumphant. "You made the right choice," she said, her voice laced with a knowing calm. The man's eyes glinted with something that could have been satisfaction. You'll see. The game is about to take a turn, and you'll be at the center of it. Her legs felt weak beneath her as she tried to steady herself, still unable to fully grasp what was happening, what she had just agreed to. The world felt different now, as if the rules had shifted, as if everything she had ever known was now nothing more than a piece on the board. The woman stepped closer. Don't worry, you'll understand soon enough. The first move has been made. The man nodded, his expression unreadable. We're just getting started. And as the words settled in her mind, a realization hit her. There was no going back. She was no longer in control, and the game they had started was about to consume her completely. The door behind her opened slowly, but she didn't move. She didn't even flinch. The only thing she felt now was the weight of the choice she had just made. The game was on, and she was a part of it. The door creaked open, but she didn't turn around. Her body felt frozen in place, like a statue carved from fear and uncertainty. The woman and the man stood behind her, their presence looming like dark clouds, their eyes never leaving her. She wanted to run, to escape this place, but the words they had spoken, the weight of their promises and threats, kept her rooted to the spot. Every step she took felt like it would push her deeper into something she didn't fully understand. The man spoke again, his voice low, measured. Now that you've made your choice, it's time to learn what comes next. Her heart raced. What comes next? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper, betraying the panic rising inside her. The woman's smile was cold, almost pitying. You'll learn soon enough. You're a part of something bigger now. You're not just a player anymore. You're the key. Her breath caught in her throat. The key, she repeated, her mind spinning. The man nodded slowly, as if this was something she should already know. Everything you thought you understood about the world, it's not real. Not anymore. You're standing at the precipice of something that will change everything. She shook her head. I don't understand. I didn't choose this. I didn't want this. The woman stepped closer, her gaze never wavering. You didn't have a choice. We've already told you this was always meant to happen. You've been living in a world of illusion. But now you get to see the truth. The truth. The words echoed in her mind, pressing in on her, suffocating her. She turned toward the door, her body moving instinctively. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't. But as her foot moved, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The sound reverberated through her body, making her jump. You can't leave, the man said, his tone soft, almost regretful. Not yet. Her pulse raced. What do you want from me? What have you done to Mark? The words spilled from her lips before she could stop them, panic and anger flooding her voice. The woman's expression shifted just slightly, her eyes flashing with something dark. Mark was never your concern. He was a means to an end. You're the one we needed. She didn't understand. Mark, her husband, the man she had trusted. He was part of this. How could he be? Why would he be? Why would he do this? Why did he betray me? The man's voice was calm, almost like he was explaining something simple. Mark didn't betray you. He followed orders, just like you will. And now your path is set. You can't walk away from this. None of us can. Her head spun. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. She wanted to scream, to run, to push them away and escape into the unknown. But there was no unknown. There was only them. Only this twisted game that she had been pulled into. You'll understand soon enough, the woman said, her voice almost like a lullaby. The decisions you make from this point forward will decide everything. You'll be the one who shifts the balance. You'll be the one who guides us all. She stepped back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She wanted to argue, to shout, to make them understand how impossible this was. But the more she tried to fight it, the more her mind seemed to blur, to fade into the quiet chaos of their words. The man looked at her with eyes that saw too much. "You've always been a part of this. You just didn't know it. But now you do." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating, like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for her next move. Her legs felt weak beneath her, and she had to brace herself against the desk to keep from collapsing. The woman's smile grew a little wider. "It's time for you to step up, to see things for what they truly are." She took a step back, her mind racing. "No, I don't want this. I don't want to be a part of your game. I don't care about your truth. I just want out. I want my life back." The man's eyes hardened. "Your life was never yours. Your life was always a part of the plan. And now you will learn what it means to be part of the bigger picture." Her heart raced, and her thoughts splintered as she tried to make sense of it all. There was no way out. She had no choice. Her life had been nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion, a game that had already been played without her knowledge. The woman stepped forward, her voice softer now, almost coaxing. "You've been chosen for something important. It's time you accept your role." Her body trembled as the truth, or what they called the truth, settled in. There was no running. There was no escape. Her mind felt like it was on the verge of breaking. Every part of her screamed to deny it, to fight back, to refuse their twisted game. But something inside her knew. She was already too deep. The world had changed, and there was no going back. "Your place is here now," the man said, his voice final, as if it was already decided. "And you'll do what's necessary. You will help us achieve what we've all been working toward." Her stomach twisted with dread. She was no longer a player in her own life. She was just a pawn in their game. The world around her felt distorted, as if everything she had ever known had become a mere reflection in a shattered mirror. The walls, once familiar, now seemed to press in on her, closing off any sense of escape. She could feel her pulse quicken, a knot of panic tightening in her chest. But the air was thick, suffocating, and it was hard to breathe. Her hands trembled as she reached for the desk, her mind swirling with impossible thoughts. The man's words echoed in her ears, his voice a constant reminder of how far she had fallen into this web. "You will do what's necessary." What was necessary? What did they want from her? And why? Her mind spun, each question pushing her further into a frenzy, yet none of the answers seemed to make sense. She wanted to scream. She wanted to demand that they tell her everything, but the truth was, she wasn't sure she could handle any more of it. Her eyes darted around the room. The file, the photographs, the silence. It all felt too much. Her life had been taken from her. No, it had been rewritten, and she had no say in any of it. Mark, he was a part of this, whether she liked it or not. And now she was too. Her breath caught in her throat as a realization began to settle over her, cold and heavy. She wasn't just a victim in this game. She was part of the plan. It wasn't about whether she accepted it or not. It was about what she would do with it. The choices she made from here on out would decide everything. The woman watched her, her eyes cold and calculating, almost amused by her silence. "You still think you have a choice, don't you?" She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. There was a lump in her throat, thick and painful, that kept her from forming the words. The man stepped forward, his gaze piercing. "There's no running. No pretending you don't know anymore. You've crossed the line. You're part of this world now. You'll help us shape what's coming next." The air in the room seemed to grow colder with each word. The heaviness pressed down on her like a weight. She couldn't escape. She was trapped. But as her mind raced, trying to think of a way out, something inside her, some small spark, refused to accept it. No, this couldn't be her reality. She refused to believe it. She took a shaky breath and steadied herself. "I don't care what you say. I don't care about your plan, your game. or your twisted idea of what's necessary. I'm not going to play along. The woman's lips curled into a smirk. You think you still have control? You think you can just walk away from this? It's too late for that. You've already been chosen. I don't care, she replied, her voice stronger now, though still trembling. I will care, and I will make my own choices. Whatever this is, whatever you want, I'm not going to let it define me. The man's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. You still don't get it, do you? You don't have a choice. You've already played your part. It's been set in motion. Her heart raced faster now. She could feel the panic building again. But something inside her shifted. The words were meant to break her, to make her feel powerless. But for the first time, she was starting to see through it. She had always been in control of her life, until now. She had allowed herself to be swept along by this twisted game. But she wasn't just a pawn. She wasn't just going to stand still and accept it. There had to be a way out. But how? The room was silent for a moment, the tension thick in the air, and for a fleeting second, she allowed herself to consider the impossible, to believe there was still hope. The woman stepped toward her, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, a predatory gleam in her eyes. You're deluding yourself if you think you can walk away from this. You're already in it. You'll help us, whether you like it or not. But something flickered in the back of her mind. Something sharp. A thought. A decision. She straightened up, her breath steadying as she met the woman's gaze. I'm not going to help you. I won't be a part of this anymore. I'm done. The woman's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. But it was enough. Enough for her to see that there was a crack in their facade. And for the first time, she felt a spark of defiance rise within her. You're wrong, she said, her voice unwavering. I may have been caught in this game, but I'm not going to play by your rules anymore. I will find a way out. The man stepped forward, his eyes filled with an unsettling calm. You think it's that simple? You think you can just walk away and undo everything we've done? You're not ready for the consequences. Her legs shook, but she didn't back down. I'll face whatever comes, but I'll never be part of your game. Never again. The silence stretched between them, and the tension seemed to snap like a wire. The woman's eyes flashed with something dangerous, and the man's gaze never wavered. You will regret this, the man said, his voice low and threatening. But she stood firm, every fiber of her being refusing to be broken. Let's see about that, she replied, her voice steady, her resolve unyielding. And for the first time, she believed it. She wasn't a pawn anymore. The game was far from over. But she was no longer playing by their rules. The tension in the room was unbearable, like a storm just before it broke. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, the man and the woman both waiting for her to falter, to make a mistake. But she didn't. Not this time. Her heart raced, but she stood her ground, every muscle in her body tense, ready for whatever came next. The world seemed to tilt, but she refused to fall. You think you can just defy us? The woman's voice cut through the air, sharp and cold. You think there's a way out of this? She swallowed hard, her throat dry, but her voice didn't waver. I don't know, but I'm not staying here, not like this. Not with you. The man moved, his steps slow, deliberate, his presence suffocating as he approached her. There was no fear in his eyes, only cold certainty. You're not in control. You think you can fight back. There are things far worse than you realize. Things that will make you wish you had never crossed us. Her chest tightened, but she didn't look away. She didn't flinch. I've already crossed you, and I'm not going to be scared into submission. Whatever happens next, it's my choice. The woman laughed, a sound that sent chills down her spine. You think you still have a choice? You think we'd let you walk away after everything you've seen? The man stood just inches away now, his eyes dark, unblinking. This is bigger than you, bigger than all of us. You're trapped, and you'll soon realize it. But she didn't care. He was right about one thing. She was trapped. But she wasn't trapped by fear or by their twisted game. No, she was trapped by a force even stronger. The one inside her. The one that refused to bow down, to let them win. I don't care what you think, she said, her voice low but fierce. You can't control me anymore. The silence that followed was thick, oppressive. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The man's eyes flickered, a brief, imperceptible flash of something. Confusion? Doubt. She couldn't tell, but it was enough. Enough to make her feel the slightest glimmer of power returning to her. The woman's smile twisted into something colder. You'll regret this. You'll learn what happens when you defy us. I'll learn, she replied, standing tall. But I won't regret it. For the first time since she had walked into this nightmare, she felt like she was taking control. It was a small step, but it was hers. They couldn't take that from her, no matter what they threw at her next. The door behind her opened again, but she didn't turn. She could hear the soft shuffle of feet, the breath of someone else, entering the room. Someone who had been watching this entire time. Her heart skipped a beat. Was this part of the plan? Were they going to bring in someone else? Another piece to this sickening puzzle? But when she heard the voice, she froze. Let her go. It was Mark, her husband. She spun around, her pulse thundering in her ears, her legs shaking. He stood in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite read. Was it fear? Regret? Mark. Her voice was a whisper, barely audible, as if speaking louder would shatter whatever fragile hope she was clinging to. He stepped forward, his expression torn. I tried to protect you, but they wouldn't let me. I had no choice. I didn't want this to happen. Her chest tightened. You didn't want this? She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Then why? Why did you let them do this? His voice cracked, the pain evident. I thought I was protecting you. I thought I could keep you safe by staying in their game. But it's bigger than I ever understood. They control everything. The woman and the man didn't speak. They just watched, like puppeteers waiting for the strings to pull them back in. Mark continued, his voice raw with emotion. I thought I was doing the right thing by staying with them, by playing along. But when I saw you caught in this, when I saw what they were doing to you, I couldn't just stand by anymore. Her hands trembled, the reality of the situation crashing over her. Mark, her husband, had been a part of this all along. He had known. He had helped them. But now he was here, standing before her, offering something she never thought she'd hear. An apology. A confession. You could have left, she whispered, her voice shaking. You could have fought back. You could have warned me. I should have, he said, his voice filled with regret. But I was afraid. Afraid of what they'd do to you, to me, to us. I thought if I kept quiet, if I played along, I could protect you from the worst of it. But I was wrong. The room seemed to spin as she tried to process it all. Mark wasn't just the man she'd married. He was a player in this twisted game, too. But now it seemed something had shifted in him. She took a step closer, her voice steadying. Then help me. Help me get out of here. Help me end this. His eyes widened. You don't understand. They're watching. If we try to leave, if we do anything that goes against them, they'll make sure we regret it. The woman's cold smile widened. You've made your choice. You can't change it now. Mark's face twisted with emotion, the conflict clear in his eyes. We can still change it, he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. I need to figure out how. For the first time in what felt like forever, she had hope. Not in them, not in their game, but in him. In Mark. And maybe, just maybe, they still had a chance. That Mark's words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of the decision he was about to make. The silence between them felt suffocating, thick with the tension of 1,000 unspoken thoughts. But she could see it now, the crack in his armor, the doubt in his eyes. He wasn't just a pawn anymore. He was looking for a way out too. She didn't know if she could trust him fully, not yet, not after everything that had happened. But in that moment, something inside her told her that they could still fight back. The woman and the man were watching, still silent, still as statues. They were waiting, calculating. It was clear they expected her to crumble, to fall into their hands like everyone else before her. But she wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. She stepped closer to Mark, her voice barely a whisper, but strong. "We have to do this. We can't let them control us anymore. They'll destroy everything if we let them." His gaze flickered between her and the two figures behind her, and for a split second, she saw the flicker of fear in his eyes. But then he nodded, his jaw tightening as he took a deep breath. "I'll help you," he said, his voice low. But there was something new in it. Determination. The woman's smile faltered just for a moment, but it was enough. She noticed. They both noticed. "We'll stop them," Mark continued, his voice growing steadier. "But it's not going to be easy. We'll have to play by their rules until we figure out how to break free." The man, who had been silent, suddenly moved, his cold eyes narrowing. "You think you can play their game?" he sneered. "You think you can outsmart us? You're not the first to try, and you won't be the last." His words hit her like a slap in the face. He was trying to intimidate her, to make her second-guess everything. But this time, she wasn't scared. "We'll see about that," she said, her voice growing more confident. Mark gave her a quick look, his eyes wide. "You don't understand," he said urgently. "They're not just playing games. This goes deeper than we know. They've planned everything. I know," she interrupted, her voice rising with every word. "I know what they've done, but I won't be part of it anymore. You don't have to be either. We can fight back." The woman stepped forward, a look of cold amusement on her face. "Fight back," she echoed. "You think you can do that? You think you have the power to stop us?" For the first time, her voice wasn't just chilling. It was tinged with something else, something almost worried. Mark took a step toward the woman, his voice rough with emotion. "I won't let you take her. I won't let you control us anymore." The man stepped in front of the woman, his eyes burning with cold fury. "You don't get it," he said, his voice low, dangerous. "You can't win this. You can't escape us. We're too deep in this game. You've already lost." But she refused to let his words break her. She looked at Mark, her eyes locked on his, and something inside her shifted. There was a plan forming, even if it was still unclear. The plan that might give them a chance, might give them a fighting chance to turn everything around. "We have one shot," she said quietly, but with fire in her voice. "And we're not going down without a fight." Mark nodded, a flicker of hope rising in his eyes. He stepped closer to her, his hand brushing hers for just a moment, as if to remind her they were in this together. "Whatever happens next," he said, his voice soft but firm, "we do it together." And for the first time since this nightmare had started, she didn't feel completely alone. There was a chance, a small one, but it was there. The woman's eyes narrowed, and the man took a step back, his gaze still locked on them. "You really think you can change anything?" the man asked, his voice dark with amusement. "You think you can change the game?" She held his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. "I don't know yet, but I'm sure as hell going to try." And just like that, she knew. They weren't just fighting for their lives anymore. They were fighting for their freedom, for control over their own destinies. The game was far from over, but now they were no longer players in it. They were rewriting the rules. Mark squeezed her hand, a silent promise. "We'll get through this. Together." The door slammed open, and two figures stepped inside, their presence almost suffocating. It was them, their true enemies, the ones who controlled everything, pulling all the strings. The people who had orchestrated this twisted game from the very beginning. But this time, they weren't going to just play along. This time, they were going to fight back. The stakes were higher than they had ever been, and the line between winning and losing was razor thin. But there was one thing they both knew now. They weren't going down without a fight. And maybe, just maybe, this would be the twist they never saw coming. The room was heavy with the oppressive air of a final confrontation. The figures in the doorway were imposing, almost statuesque, as if they had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the inevitable showdown. They had been pulling the strings, setting the stage, and now they were here to ensure the final act played out the way they wanted. But this time, things were different. She stood tall, her body trembling slightly, but her resolve solid. Mark was beside her, his hand still in hers, an anchor amidst the storm. They were in this together now, and for the first time, it wasn't just about survival. It was about reclaiming control. "Step aside," the man who had spoken earlier said, his voice icy, full of authority. "You're wasting your time." She didn't move. Neither did Mark. "We're done listening to you," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "You've had your game. We're ending it now." The woman in the doorway smiled, a cold, calculating smile. "You think you can end this? You're nothing but pawns. Always have been." "Maybe," Mark said, his voice low, but with a defiant edge. "But we're not playing anymore." For a moment, it was as if time had stopped. The silence was deafening, and every second felt like it dragged on forever. She could hear her heartbeat pounding in her ears, the blood rushing through her veins. Her senses were heightened, every detail sharp as a knife. The flicker of movement in the shadows, the faint creak of the floorboards under the weight of the figures in front of her. It all seemed to stretch out in a slow, suffocating crawl. Then the woman spoke again, her voice dripping with venom. "You're making a mistake. This isn't something you can undo. You have no idea what you're up against. And yet, we're still standing," she shot back. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to stay calm. "We're still here. You've tried to break us, but we're not broken." The man moved, his eyes never leaving hers, cold and calculating. "You think you can fight us? That you can stand against us and win?" She didn't answer. Instead, she stood there, the weight of his words hanging in the air. She didn't need to speak. The determination in her eyes said everything. And then something changed. A flicker, a small shift in the woman's posture. A brief hesitation. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but she caught it. The woman was worried. Her chest tightened, but she couldn't let herself feel relief. Not yet. Not until they were free. Mark spoke again, his voice steady, unwavering. "We're not afraid of you. Not anymore." The man's expression darkened, his fists clenched. "You're playing a dangerous game. You think you can just walk away? You think you can win?" She wasn't sure what had triggered it, the man's fury or the woman's shift. But the room suddenly seemed to pulse with an electric charge. Everything felt like it was on the edge of snapping, the tension hanging in the air like a lightning storm just waiting to strike. Mark squeezed her hand. "We've already won," he whispered, as if to himself, but loud enough for her to hear. And in that moment, everything changed. The figures in the doorway seemed to recoil, just for a fraction of a second. Their certainty wavered. The woman's eyes flicked to the man, her expression unreadable. For the first time, they weren't in control. They were reacting. She didn't know how or why, but she could feel the balance shifting. The game was no longer theirs to dictate. Her mind raced, trying to process everything. But one thing was clear. They had a chance. A real chance. "Get out," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. The woman laughed, but it lacked conviction. "You think we're just going to walk away? You're deluding yourself. You have no idea what you're up against." "I know exactly what I'm up against," she said, stepping forward, her heart pounding with adrenaline. "And I'm done playing by your rules." The room seemed to grow colder, the air heavier with each word that was exchanged. There was a sense of finality, of a line being crossed. They couldn't go back now. Whatever came next, there was no undoing it. The man's voice was low, dangerous. "You think you can just walk away from this, from us? You think you have any control left in this game?" "No," she said, her eyes locked onto his with unwavering certainty. "But I don't need control. I just need to stop playing." For a brief moment, the man's eyes flickered. He knew deep down that this wasn't something he could win with force. This wasn't a game that could be played by the same rules anymore. And then, like a snap, the tension broke. The woman stepped back, her eyes narrowed, calculating. She said nothing more. The man followed suit, the finality of their silence more unsettling than any words could be. Without another word, the figures turned and began to walk away, the weight of their departure hanging heavy in the air. She didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time since this nightmare had begun, she wasn't afraid. Mark turned to her, his eyes filled with an unreadable expression. "We did it," he said softly. "No," she replied, shaking her head. "We've only just begun." And with that, they walked away from the game. Together, the silence hung thick between them as the door slammed shut behind the woman and the man. They had left. But something wasn't right. The feeling in the pit of her stomach told her this wasn't over. Not yet. She turned to Mark, his face pale, his hands trembling. His attempt at composure fell apart the moment their eyes met. This wasn't relief. It was something darker, something they had both ignored for too long. "Mark," she said, her voice trembling despite herself. "What are we not seeing?" He shook his head slowly, his eyes wide. "They didn't just leave. This is a trick." Her heart sank. "What do you mean?" "They've been playing us," he murmured, his breath shallow. "And now they've set us up for the next part. The real game." Her pulse quickened. She scanned the room, her eyes darting to every corner, every shadow. Had they been watching them this whole time? Were they still watching? Before she could react, she heard it. A soft click, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. It was coming from the walls. The floorboards creaked underfoot as the realization hit her like a gut punch. There were cameras, hidden cameras everywhere. She could feel their eyes on her on them. Even now. "We need to leave," she said urgently. "Now." Mark didn't respond immediately. His eyes darted around, his expression growing darker. "They're not going to let us just walk away," he said, almost to himself. "They never do." "Mark, please," she whispered, grabbing his arm, pulling him toward the door. "If we stay here, we're trapped. This is it. This is the end." But as her hand reached for the doorknob, the lights flickered. A low hum filled the room, then a loud, bone-chilling screech. The door didn't open, and then a voice, cold, calculated. It came from nowhere and everywhere at once. "You really thought you could escape?" Her stomach dropped. The man and the woman were still out there, pulling the strings, playing their final move. A new terror gripped her heart as she realized something even worse. This wasn't just a game. This was their punishment. And they were the final pieces. The voice echoed through the room, sending a chill down her spine. It wasn't just a voice. It was a presence, all-consuming, suffocating. "You really thought you could escape?" Her breath caught in her throat. She glanced at Mark, his face drawn with a mix of fear and defiance. It was clear this was not over. The door was still locked. The room, once their temporary sanctuary, now felt like a cage. Mark stepped back, eyes wide, as if searching for an answer, a way out. This isn't the end, is it?" His voice trembled. She shook her head, her mind racing. There's always a way out, she thought. But her confidence was shaken. Every step forward seemed to lead to another trap, another wall closing in. The voice spoke again, this time more menacing. You have no choice now. The game is finished, and so are you. Her heart pounded. Every muscle in her body screamed for her to run, but there was nowhere to go. The walls felt as if they were closing in, squeezing the air from her lungs. Yet, through the panic, a flicker of clarity pierced the fog of fear. She grabbed Mark's hand, squeezing it tightly. "Don't listen to them," she said firmly, her voice more steady than she felt. "We're not their puppets. Not anymore." Mark's eyes softened. He squeezed her hand back, his resolve growing stronger. "You're right. We're not their game pieces." Suddenly, the room seemed to shift. The pressure that had held them in place began to loosen. The screeching noise from the walls died down. The low hum faded into silence. It was over. They weren't trapped anymore. They hadn't won yet, but they had taken control, and that in itself was victory. The door creaked open. She didn't hesitate. Taking Mark's hand, she pulled him toward the door. The outside world awaited them, full of unknowns, full of possibilities. For the first time, she didn't look back. Together, they stepped into freedom.